The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the breath of the gods seemed to mingle with the sulphurous steam rising from the hot springs. King Leonidas of Sparta stood motionless on the rocky outcrop, his form silhouetted against the dawn sky like a statue of Ares himself. Below him, the Aegean Sea stretched endlessly eastward, its waters dark with the promise of war. "My lord," came the voice of Denix, his most trusted captain. "The scouts report, the Persian host has crossed the Hellespont. Their numbers, ... He paused, searching for words that could capture the magnitude of what approached. Their numbers darken the horizon like a plague of locusts. Leonidas turned, his scarred face betraying neither fear nor doubt. At 49 years of age, he had weathered countless battles, but none like this. The messenger who had arrived 3 days prior still haunted his thoughts. Xerxes I, the great king of Persia, demanded earth and water as symbols of submission. The Spartan king had provided his answer by hurling the Persian envoy into a well. But that defiant gesture seemed hollow now as reports filtered in of the approaching Persian war machine. The year was 480 before Christ, and the very foundations of the Greek world trembled. Xerxes commanded not merely an army, but a walking empire. Persians, Medes, Scythians, Indians, Egyptians, and dozens of other nations marched under his banner. Conservative estimates placed his force at over 200,000 men, though some whispered of numbers that reached into the millions. According to historical accounts documented by Herodotus, whose writings remain our primary source for these events, the Persian army represented the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient world. Against this tide of humanity, Leonidas commanded just 300 Spartan warriors, supported by perhaps 7,000 Greek allies from various city-states. The mathematics of war had never seemed more brutal, yet the Spartan king felt no tremor of uncertainty. He had consulted the oracle at Delphi, and her cryptic prophecy echoed in his mind. Either Sparta would fall, or a king of Sparta must die. As the sun climbed higher, the first refugees began streaming through the pass, families fleeing the advancing Persian army. Their possessions strapped to their backs, terror etched in their faces. Children clung to their mothers' robes, while old men stumbled along ancient paths their ancestors had walked in peace. These were the people of Phocis and Locris, whose lands now lay beneath the Persian heel. Captain Denix, Leonidas commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years of kingship. "Send word to the Thespians and Thebans, tell them to take their positions along the ridge. The Persians will arrive by sunset tomorrow, and when they do, they will find Greeks waiting." The narrow pass of Thermopylae, barely wide enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast, had been chosen for good reason. Here, among the thermal springs that gave the place its name, the hot gates' numbers would count for nothing. The Persians would be forced to funnel their vast army through this bottleneck, where Spartan shields and spears could hold back even the tide of the world. As evening approached, Leonidas walked among his 300, each man a product of the Agoge Sparta's brutal training system that forged warriors from childhood. These were not mere soldiers but living weapons, their bodies scarred by years of combat, their minds hardened by a culture that valued death in battle above life in dishonor. The Persian encampment stretched beyond the horizon, a city of silk and bronze that had materialized on the plains north of Thermopylae like a fever dream. Xerxes I sat upon his golden throne, elevated on a platform that allowed him to survey his vast host. At 35 years of age, he was the undisputed master of the known world, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. Majesty Mardonius, his most trusted general, approached with measured steps. The Persian noble's face bore the weathered look of a man who had conquered nations for his king. "The Greek positions have been scouted. They hold the pass with perhaps 7,000 men, no more." Xerxes gestured languidly, his jeweled fingers catching the light from 100 oil lamps. 7,000, he laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "I have brought 500,000 warriors to crush these insects, and they dare to stand before me with 7,000. The great king's pavilion bustled with activity as commanders from across the empire presented their reports. Art, satrap of Sardis, detailed the Greek defensive positions. Hydarnes, commander of the Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard of 10,000 outlined battle plans. Yet for all their strategic wisdom, none could fully comprehend the nature of their enemy. Historical records from Persian sources, though scarce, suggest that Xerxes genuinely believed his overwhelming numerical superiority would quickly resolve. The Greek resistance. The following morning brought a scene that would echo through the ages. Xerxes dispatched a mounted herald to the Greek lines, bearing terms of surrender that seemed almost generous. The messenger, resplendent in Persian finery, rode through the hot gates under a flag of truce, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the ancient stones. Hear the words of Xerxes, King of kings, Lord of lords, the herald proclaimed in accented Greek. Your cities need not burn. Your families need not suffer. Lay down your arms, submit to the great king's mercy, and you shall be treated with honor. Leonidas emerged from the Greek lines, his bronze helmet catching the sun. Behind him marched a phalanx of Spartan warriors, their red cloaks flowing like blood in the morning breeze. The contrast was striking. The Persian herald's silk and gold against the Spartans' simple bronze and leather. Tell your king, Leonidas replied, his voice carrying across the pass, that he may take our weapons if he can come and get them himself. The herald's face flushed with indignation. You speak boldly for a man who commands so few against so many. The great king offers you the opportunity to live. Do not be a fool. Leonidas smiled, an expression that sent chills through the Persian messenger. Stranger, you speak of living and dying as if they were choices. We Spartans have already made our choice. We will live forever in glory, or die today in honor. Tell Xerxes that Sparta sends her regards. By noon, the Persian army began its advance. The earth trembled beneath 1,000,000 feet, soldiers, horses, camels, and siege engines creating a mechanical symphony of war. The sun dimmed as clouds of dust rose from the marching columns, and the air filled with the sound of 10,000 languages spoken by warriors from every corner of the known world. Xerxes himself moved to his observation post, a throne placed on a hill overlooking the pass. From here, he expected to watch the brief but decisive destruction of Greek resistance. His immortals, so named because their ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000 men, formed the vanguard. These were the elite of the Persian army, veterans of countless campaigns, their armor gleaming with gold and silver inlay. As the afternoon wore on, tension grew thick as honey. The Greek allies, Thespians, Thebans and others, took their positions along the narrow pass. Each man knew that retreat was impossible. The Persians would show no mercy to those who had dared resist the great king's will. Leonidas performed the final ritual, offering libations to the gods and speaking the ancient words that had preceded every Spartan battle for generations. His 300 warriors stood in perfect formation, their shields locked, their spears pointing toward the enemy like a bronze hedge of death. The first assault came with the fury of a thunderstorm. Hydarnes led his immortals forward in perfect formation, their wicker shields gleaming in the afternoon sun, their spears bristling like a forest of death. The narrow confines of Thermopylae forced the vast Persian army into a funnel, where their numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. Hold the line, Leonidas roared, his voice cutting through the din of clashing bronze and screaming men. The Spartan phalanx stood like a wall of bronze and flesh, their shields locked in an impenetrable barrier. Behind the shield wall, long spears thrust forward in rhythmic precision, each thrust claiming Persian lives. The first wave of immortals crashed against the Greek line like ocean waves against stone cliffs. The Persians fought with desperate courage, their curved swords and battle axes ringing against Spartan shields. But the mathematics of the battlefield worked against them. In the narrow pass, only a handful of warriors could engage at any given moment, negating the Persian advantage of numbers. Captain Denix stood at Leonidas' right shoulder, his spear red with Persian blood. My lord, he called during a brief lull in the fighting, An immortal officer told me their arrows would darken the sun. Leonidas laughed grimly, parrying a Persian sword thrust with his shield. Then we shall fight in the shade, old friend. The battle raged for hours, the ground becoming slick with blood and littered with the fallen. Persian bodies piled high before the Greek line, yet still they came. Xerxes watched from his throne in growing disbelief as wave after wave of his finest warriors broke against the Spartan shields, like water against stone. Contemporary accounts, particularly those preserved in Herodotus' histories, describe the carnage at Thermopylae as unprecedented in the annals of ancient warfare. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the great king's frustration boiled over. He had expected a swift victory, a demonstration of Persian might that would cow the remaining Greek city-states into submission. Instead, his immortals lay dead in heaps, and the 300 Spartans stood unbroken. "Send the Sake," Xerxes commanded, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Send the Scythians, send every archer in the army. I want those Greeks buried under a mountain of arrows." The Persian archers advanced in ranks, their bows singing a deadly song. Thousands of arrows arced through the air, creating a shadow that briefly dimmed the sun. The Greeks raised their shields, creating a bronze canopy that rang like temple bells as the arrows struck. Most shafts shattered against the bronze, but some found their mark, and Greek warriors fell. Yet even as his men died around him, Leonidas felt no despair. This was the moment the oracle had foretold, the hour when Sparta's honor would be tested in the crucible of impossible odds. He thought of his wife, Queen Gorgo, and his young son Pleistarchus, who would one day need to understand why his father had chosen death over dishonor. The second day dawned with renewed Persian assaults. Xerxes had spent the night in council with his generals, devising new strategies to break the Greek line. He sent his Median and Sison regiments, hoping that different fighting styles might succeed where the immortals had failed. The result was the same Persian blood soaking into the rocky ground of the pass. By midday, the great king's famous composure began to crack. Stories spread through the Persian camp of his rage, how he had leaped from his throne 3 times as he watched his elite units destroyed by a handful of Greeks. His generals whispered among themselves, wondering if the gods themselves had turned against their invasion. Leonidas used the brief respite to walk among his surviving warriors. Of the original 300, perhaps 200 remained, but those who lived showed no signs of wavering. They tended their wounds with the casual efficiency of professional soldiers, sharpened their weapons, and prepared for another day of dying. "Brothers," the Spartan king addressed his men, his voice carrying the weight of destiny. "We have already won. Every hour we hold this pass, every Persian life we take, sends a message to all of Greece. They will know that free men fought here, and that freedom is worth any price." The warriors answered with a wordless roar that echoed off the cliffs, a sound that chilled Persian hearts and gave strength to Greek allies throughout the pass. The third day brought an ominous stillness to the Persian camp. Xerxes had withdrawn his forces, and the silence that followed their retreat was more unnerving than the clash of arms. Leonidas stood at the edge of the Greek position, his weathered face troubled by an intuition that had served him well through decades of warfare. "Something has changed," he murmured to Denix, who had become his constant shadow through the long hours of battle. "The great king does not withdraw from victory. He withdraws to find another path to it." The answer came with the dawn, and it wore the face of treachery. Ephialtes of Moles, a local shepherd whose twisted back had prevented him from joining the Greek forces, had made his choice. Driven by promises of Persian gold and bitter resentment at his rejection, he had approached Xerxes' pavilion under cover of darkness. "Great King," Ephialtes had whispered, prostrating himself before the golden throne, "I know a path through the mountains, a goat track that leads behind the Greek lines. Give me 1,000 men, and I will deliver Leonidas to you." Xerxes had listened with growing excitement as the Greek traitor outlined his plan. The Anapia path, known only to local hunters and shepherds, wound through the mountains above Thermopylae. An army could march through the night and emerge behind the Greek position, trapping the defenders between two forces. Historical sources, particularly Herodotus' detailed account, identify Ephialtes as the architect of this betrayal. Though his motivations remain debated among scholars, Hadrian, eager to restore his reputation after the failure of his immortals, volunteered to lead the flanking force. As midnight approached, he set out with his best troops, guided by the hunchbacked trader through treacherous mountain paths. The night was moonless, perfect for concealing their movement from Greek sentries. Meanwhile, Leonidas had not been idle. His instincts, honed by years of warfare, told him that the Persians were planning something. He had sent out scouts to watch the mountain passes, including a force of Phocian warriors to guard the Anapaea path. But the Phocians, untested in battle and overwhelmed by the sight of Persian immortals emerging from the darkness, had fled after offering only token resistance. The first sign of disaster came with the dawn. A Phocian runner, his face pale with terror and exhaustion, stumbled into the Greek camp with news that would seal their fate. The Persians, they're behind us, my lord. They march down the mountain even now. Leonidas received the news with the stoic calm that had defined his life. He had always known this moment would come. The oracle's prophecy had been clear. A king of Sparta must die, or Sparta itself would fall. The choice, if it could be called a choice, was simple. Denix, he commanded, send word to the Thespians and Thebans. Tell them they are released from their oaths. Let them withdraw while they still can. But even as he spoke, Leonidas knew that not all would accept this release. The Thespians, 700 strong, chose to remain. Their leader, Demophilus, spoke for them all. We came to fight beside Spartans. We will die beside Spartans. The Thebans, however, accepted the offer of withdrawal, though their departure was marked by shame rather than relief. They had fought bravely, but the prospect of certain death for a foreign cause proved too much for their resolve. As the sun climbed higher, Persian forces began to appear on the heights above the pass. Pedans had succeeded in his mission. The Greeks were trapped. Soon, the immortals would be attacking from behind while fresh Persian regiments assaulted from the front. Leonidas gathered his remaining warriors, fewer than 200 Spartans, and the 700 Thespians who had chosen to share their fate. The time for strategy had passed. Now came the hour of simple courage. Today, he told them, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead, we breakfast well, for tonight we dine in Hades. Remember, we are Spartans. We do not retreat, we do not surrender. We do not ask for quarter, and we give none. Let the Persians remember this day as the moment they learned the price of Greek freedom. The warriors answered with a roar that echoed off the mountains, a sound of defiance that would outlive them all. The sun reached its zenith as the final act of the Thermopylae tragedy began to unfold. Xerxes, sensing victory at last, had positioned himself on his throne to witness the destruction of the Greek force that had humiliated his empire for 3 days. The great king's army now moved with the confidence of inevitable triumph. Immortals descended from the mountain path while fresh Persian regiments advanced from the north. Leonidas stood in the center of his diminished phalanx, his bronze armor dented and stained with blood from countless encounters. Around him, the surviving Spartans and their Thespian allies formed a circle of shields and spears, their backs to the ancient wall that had been built across the narrowest part of the pass. This was their Alamo, their final redoubt where they would make their last stand. Brothers, Leonidas called out, his voice carrying across the small formation. We have fought like gods these past 3 days. Today, we join them in immortality. Remember our law, return with your shield, or upon it. There is no shame in death, only in surrender. The first Persian assault came from the north, where Artaphernes led a fresh regiment of Median warriors. They advanced cautiously, having heard tales of the carnage that had befallen their predecessors. But the Greeks were fewer now, and weariness showed in their movements despite their unbroken spirit. Archaeological evidence from the Thermopylae site, examined by modern scholars, confirms the intensity of the fighting, with bronze arrowheads and weapon fragments still discovered in the area. The clash was immediate and brutal. The Persians, emboldened by their numerical advantage and the knowledge that the Greeks were trapped, pressed forward with renewed vigor. Spartan spears found their marks, but for every Persian that fell, 2 more took his place. The mathematics of attrition had finally turned against the defenders. Captain Denix fought beside his king, his movements economical and deadly despite the wounds that decorated his body like medals of honor. "My lord," he gasped during a brief lull, "the immortals approach from behind. We have perhaps minutes before they reach us." Leonidas nodded grimly. The moment of truth had arrived. He could see Hidarne's force spreading out on the heights above them, preparing to descend and complete the encirclement. The traitor Ephialtes stood among them, his deformed figure a stark reminder of how betrayal could take any form. The Spartan king made his decision. Rather than wait for the Persians to close their trap, he would attack. It was a choice that embodied everything Sparta represented: the preference for offensive action over defensive waiting. The willingness to seek death in battle rather than accept it passively. "Spartans," he roared, raising his spear high. "Advance. Show these barbarians how Greeks die." The small band of warriors surged forward, their battle cry echoing off the cliffs. They struck the Persian line like a bronze thunderbolt, their coordinated assault driving deep into the enemy formation. Persian warriors fell back in surprise and terror as the Greeks advanced, their shields locked, their spears seeking Persian hearts with lethal precision. For a moment, it seemed as if the impossible might happen again. The Persian line wavered, and Xerxes half-rose from his throne in disbelief. Could these few hundred Greeks, exhausted and outnumbered, somehow break through his entire army? But the immortals were descending from the mountain now, and the trap was closing. Persian arrows began to fall like deadly rain, and the Greek formation started to take casualties it could not replace. Leonidas felt an arrow pierce his shoulder, then another strike his thigh, but he fought on, his spear red with Persian blood. The circle of shields grew smaller as more Greeks fell. The Thespians fought with desperate courage, their leader matching the Spartans blow for blow. But courage, however noble, could not overcome the simple mathematics of war. They were too few, and their enemies too many. Leonidas saw Denix fall, an immortal spear finding the gap in his armor. The old captain's eyes met his king's one final time, and he smiled before the darkness took him. Around them, the last of the 300 fought and died, their bronze shields forming a diminishing circle of defiance. The end came suddenly. A Persian archer, positioned on the heights, sent an arrow that found its mark in Leonidas' chest. The Spartan king staggered but did not fall, his hand still gripping his spear. He looked up at the sky, where the sun blazed overhead like the eye of Zeus himself, and smiled. "Sparta," he whispered, and fell forward onto his shield. The battle, for Leonidas' body, became a final epic in itself. A struggle that would be remembered long after the political consequences of Thermopylae had faded into history. The surviving Spartans and Thespians, perhaps 30 men in total, formed a protective circle around their fallen king, their shields locked in a final act of defiance against the Persian tide. Xerxes, witnessing the scene from his throne, felt a mixture of rage and grudging respect. These Greeks had cost him thousands of his finest warriors, had delayed his invasion for precious days, and had shown the world that Persian might was not invincible. The great king's orders were clear: take the Spartan king's body, and crucify it as an example to all who would dare resist Persian power. But the remaining Greeks would not yield their king's corpse. They fought with the fury of cornered lions, their bronze spears and swords carving a crimson path through the Persian ranks. Captain Alpheus, one of the few surviving Spartans, stood over Leonidas' body, his shield arm broken but his spear still steady. "Come then, barbarians," he roared, his voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. "Take our king if you can, but know that every step will cost you blood." The Persians advanced reluctantly, their enthusiasm dampened by the carnage they had witnessed. These were no longer men they fought, but something approaching divine fury given human form. Even the immortals, elite troops who had conquered nations, approached with caution. Modern military historians, analyzing the tactical implications of Thermopylae, note that the battle's true significance lay not in its immediate outcome, but in its demonstration of Greek military prowess and determination. The final moments came as Persian arrows darkened the sky one last time. The surviving Greeks raised their shields, but there were too few left to form an effective wall. One by one, they fell, their bodies joining their kings in the sacred earth of Thermopylae. Alpheus was among the last, taking 3 Persian spears in his chest before finally succumbing. As the dust settled and silence fell over the pass, Xerxes descended from his throne to survey the aftermath. The sight that greeted him was sobering. Persian bodies lay stacked like cordwood, their number reaching into the thousands. The cost of victory had been higher than anyone had imagined. The great king's first impulse was to mutilate Leonidas' corpse, to crucify the Spartan king as a warning to other Greeks. But Artaphernes, his trusted general, counseled differently. "Majesty," he said quietly, "this man has shown courage that will be remembered long after we are dust. To dishonor his body now would only make him a martyr. Let the Greeks honor their dead. It costs us nothing, and may buy us some measure of respect." Xerxes considered this wisdom, but his rage won out. He ordered Leonidas' body beheaded and crucified, a decision that would haunt Persian propaganda for generations. The act was seen throughout the Greek world as proof of Persian barbarity, strengthening Greek resolve rather than weakening it. The strategic consequences of Thermopylae extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The 3-day delay had given the Greek city-states precious time to organize their defenses. The Athenian fleet, under Themistocles, had used those days to position itself for the naval battle at Salamis. The Peloponnesian League had mobilized its forces for the eventual showdown at Plataea. More importantly, the moral victory belonged entirely to the Greeks. Word of the 300's stand spread like wildfire throughout the Hellenic world. In Athens, Simonides composed his immortal epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The poem would be carved in stone and carried in hearts for millennia to come. The Persian army continued its march south, but the aura of invincibility had been shattered. Greek soldiers who had trembled at the mention of Xerxes' name now spoke of him as a king whose best troops could be held by 300 Spartans. The psychological impact was immeasurable. In Sparta itself, the news of Leonidas' death was received with pride rather than mourning. Queen Gorgo, his widow, declared that her husband had achieved the highest honor a Spartan could attain, a glorious death in battle. The 300 were elevated to the status of heroes, their names inscribed in the Temple of Athena for all time. The Battle of Thermopylae had ended in Persian victory, but it had also lit a flame that would burn across the Greek world. Within a year, that flame would consume the Persian fleet at Salamis and the Persian army at Plataea. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable had been stopped, not by superior numbers or better strategy, but by the simple courage of free men who refused to bow to tyranny. Leonidas and his 300 had bought Greece its freedom with their blood, and in doing so, they had purchased immortality for themselves. Their story would be told as long as human beings valued courage over comfort, honor over life, and freedom over submission. The hot gates had been closed to the Persians, not by bronze and stone, but by the indomitable spirit of men who chose death over dishonor. The clash of titans at Thermopylae was over, but its echoes would resonate through the corridors of time forever.